Hey, all the thumbs up. Love it. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick. Thank you for that introduction. And today we're going to be doing an introduction to data management plans. There we go. Thanks. I would like to acknowledge the Silks Okanagan peoples on whose territory the University of British Columbia Okanagan is located and where I have the honor and privilege to live and play. Now, a bit of an overview. What are we doing here today? So I'm going to be starting off with some definitions. What is a data management plan? It's always good to identify what it is we're talking about before we jump in. Then next, why should you care? You've signed up, so there's a little bit of care that I think we've identified, but let's just go into the underlying philosophies and why this type of thing is important. And then finally, jumping into data management planning itself. And this is going to make up the bulk of the session. Now, just to demystify things, with the data management plan, it is a series of questions about research, right? And in the template I'll be speaking to, there are 20 questions. Some of these questions could be entire topics for a session. So in that sense, I'm not going to be able to get into the weeds of anything in that really heavily of details, but for the type of learning objectives for this session, it's two main things that by the end of this, you'll be able to, have a general awareness of data management plans and the DMP assistant. And you'll also be able to identify the types of questions and considerations in a data management plan for you to complete one on your own. Now, moving past that, where we have the learning outcomes that are a bit more behavioral on your end, a little bit more out of my control, but my hope would be that you would start drawing connections between these questions and your own research, and that either you start searching for answers on your own or you reach out. Oh, no, didn't do that. Okay, so first thing, session materials. I'm going to get out of this box just for 2 seconds, and I'm gonna drop this into the chat. Where is the chat? Chat's up here. We have some materials here, and I'm gonna ask that you go ahead and click on it, and I'll show you exactly. Here we go. Yeah, so I've prepared some resources as we go through this all. General resources, the DMP assistant, which I'll be referring to a lot today, you can go there. RDM training resources, everything general. As I go through the DMP assistant, I've put together a series of different resources for each section. So you can kind of guide yourself through as you're going through and listening to me talk. If you want to split your attention, I totally get that, Zoom room attention. But if you want to return to something like this afterwards, you absolutely can. Going down, you can see there's data collection, documentation, metadata, preservation, sharing, and reuse. Getting down to the ethics and resources for sensitive data, a lot of resources for sensitive data, have some data policies, how the tri-agency grants are interacting with this, as well as resources for Indigenous data. Now, before we kind of go through this whole list, I do have this link right at the top, Session Padlet. You can go ahead and click on that if you want. Oh, is my link not clickable? Thanks, Caitlin. You're the best. Cool. So I have set up a Padlet here, and just for us to kind of get to know each other a little bit, we have 3 questions. What is your discipline or department? Type of research data or materials are you working with? What are you hoping to get from this session? I'm apologetic, Anthony. We'll work on that. And yeah, so if you want to answer these questions, you can just press the plus, type in your answer. I'll give people a couple of minutes so you can just see who else is in this room. We can kind of get to know each other on that level. Okay, so if some people are looking for some basics, some are looking for more specific stuff. I'm gonna move away from this and jump into the session, but feel free to just keep poking at this. I might look at it a little bit later on, just so I can frame how this is going. But I think I have an idea of what people are looking for. All right, so what is a data management plan? A lot of people are looking for some basics, and here, let's jump in. But before we do, I think it's best to define what research data is. Now, this definition came from a project that I was a part of. It was one of the Alliance-funded Data Champions grants. And we worked with 4 different research faculties and their students to set out to build some resources around RDM. And there was people from ecology, health and exercise science, digital humanities, and visual anthropology. And it was really interesting in terms of how they define data. And that this first part was widely agreed upon, that research data are used as primary sources or evidence to support and validate an inquiry, research questions, and or creative work. You're going out to solve a question. You have a thesis. whatever type of materials or thing that you're using to answer that question, that is your research data. This bottom part, and I'm not going to read it word for word, but it was really about the context of research data. And one thing that was really problematized by the person working in digital humanities and visual anthropology was this idea of raw data, that data does have this raw pattern, that there's somehow no subjective interpretation of it, and that they were really adamant that data is always placed in some sort of subjective lens, that there is no real raw data. So I will kind of use that term in this quote unquote, but knowing that data is really manifested by so many different subjective and subtly subjective lenses. And so knowing that it really is determined by context and keeping with disciplinary norms. So what is research data management? So we got that data. It's the practices and activities over the research lifecycle that include planning, collecting, processing, analyzing, document, storing, sharing, and preserving data. RDM, it's doing research. This is very much just doing research. The data is the star of the show, but this is, once again, it is all about just doing research. And when I refer to this research data lifecycle, this is a depiction of that. But when we're talking about what is a data management plan, it's planning for your research process, but not so much thinking about the paper as the output, but thinking of the integrity of the data as you go through this. So you create a data management plan, and it's going to outline how are you creating this data or collecting it or collating it? What's it going to look like? Where are you going to store it? And that, you might receive it in one form, but you might need to manipulate it in some way for you to derive information from it, from you to analyze it. And that once you've analyzed it, you might need to visualize it. You might need to put it into some other form to make it valuable so you can get that paper and, get your publications. But then once that process is done, looking at data as a resource that you might want to preserve in a data repository for others to access and reuse. And it's this circular motion. So this is kind of the basis of what we're talking about here. And so the DMP Assistant is just a tool for preparing DMPs. It's a website that has a web form, and all of these questions, you can just fill them out. And they're step-by-step questions about your research data, but again, very much linked to what your research looks like. And it can be linked to your methodology and how you're formulating your hypothesis. I would really encourage that. That type of language tends to be left out of data management planning and of these sessions. I think if your hypotheses and your methodology are not data-centric or aren't considering these type of things, they can fall off. And so I really would encourage people that as they're developing projects, as if you're working in research support and you're teaching these concepts, to start sewing the idea together of DMPs and just quality research, because that's where it all really forms. And I know that the term open science can be a bit alienating to people who might not see themselves in science, but this idea of open research is really about transparency, reproducibility, and DMPs really provide that type of agency. The DMP Assistant provides guidance and examples. So for each question, they do provide suggestions how you can approach them. There's also some built-in discipline-specific templates. I'll speak a little bit more about that, but for specific types of research, they will ask different questions to help you think about different things. There are examples provided by the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, as well as public data management plans that are shared within the DMP Assistant itself. Both those links can be found too on that resource guide. Why should I care? Okay, let me make a sales pitch. Hope it's not too much of a sales pitch, but there are some underlying philosophies to this. The first one, you might have heard people refer to something called the FAIR principles. These stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And this idea that after a project's completion, data should be findable. You should be able to access it. Interoperable, it should work across platforms, across machines, and it should be reusable. Now, the underlying philosophy of the FAIR principles are the same underlying philosophy of open access publications, that so much of research is paid with government funding, it's public money, and so little of the outputs are actually available to the public. Now, in 2015, the Tri-Agency put out their open access policy that we want our papers to be out there. There's been varying levels of success with that, but there's been some movement that knowledge should be for everybody. Now, the FAIR principles and this idea of RDM are really coming from the idea that very, very few people are paid from these grants to just sit at their computer and write a paper, right? They're paid to collect data. That's where the research funding goes to. And that collection of data, that can be so many different things, right? That can be going out interviewing people, that can be using an instrument to collect data. But at the end of the day, research is very centered on this data that never or very seldomly reaches the light of day, but there's so much utility in it. People who want to build upon these studies, people who want to see what can be done. It's the idea of data as a utility to not only, check the integrity of knowledge, but to build the capacity of knowledge building is really important. Now, this idea of academic integrity is also really underlying this, and just I'm picking out the drudgery here, but it's worth noting that articles get retracted quite often. If you go to a website called retractionwatch.com, you'll see that it's an unfortunate thing that articles will make it through peer review, and then sometimes people will actually start digging into the data, sometimes years after an article is published, and it'll turn out that there were some questions here. This article in the middle, I have to pay attention to this just because it was the most egregious one. That 20 years ago, somebody published a paper on Alzheimer's. And since then, all of the research going to Alzheimer's were based off this one paper that he found the spot in the brain that's responsible for Alzheimer's. Where we're talking 20 years of research, billions of dollars in funding. They finally got his data after 20 years, and people have been trying to get it for those 2 decades. He falsified his data and wasted that much time of researchers, that much public funding, and like, what a wild thing. Now, like these are only 4 other cases that I have surrounding these, but it's not only the person who did this in this paper whose reputation is ruined, but if there's grad students working in that lab, that can be very damaging to them. If there's people who are writing papers that are based on these assumptions, that's super damaging to them, right? And like this is the worst part of academic integrity, flipping it to a side where it might be more along the lines of catching mistakes. That if, again, focusing on that angle of open research, that transparency, reproducibility, catching little mistakes in data, this is really what is underpinning RDM as promoting academic integrity. And then finally, so I gave you the philosophies, what I believe. If you want tri-agency funding, you're going to have to do this. I'm sorry, that this one is way worse, but it is kind of more pertinent. They did produce a policy that came out 2 years ago for researchers. Data management plans are being phased in to be part of the funding application process. On the resources page I gave you is the most updated list of all the grants requiring data management plans now. They are going to be phased in as time goes on. The second one, data deposits. They are going to start requiring data to be deposited after a research project is done. This one's a few years off. That I can't see this happening maybe 3 or 4 years, but it's worth to know that it's coming down the pipe. And a lot of the impetus with data management plans is to keep data's integrity throughout that research lifecycle. So by the time you get to the end of a project, you can actually deposit it, and it's interpretable, it's reusable, it's good data. Should be noted, we're not just, or sorry, I'm not part of the tri-agency. The tri-agency is also putting the onus not only on researchers, but on institutions. And for all tri-agency eligible institutions, they had to create an RDM institutional strategy, March 1st of last year. Those are published. You can look at your own institution, see what they're doing. But the idea is that institutions have to support this type of thing. They can't leave their researchers on their own. So in terms of the value of this, to kind of summarize everything that I said, it'll save you time and headaches. Like it does seem like it is front loading a bit more work, and it is. I won't lie about that. It is front loading more work, but the idea is to avoid any disruptions or unforeseen circumstances that will really cause problems in your research workflows. And the second one, to help you identify, services, tools, workflows, practices that are best suited to your work. I see a lot of people who are trying to solve or trying to do research with tools that they just don't make sense with what they're trying to do. They might be comfortable with it. They might have heard about this particular platform or service. But if you really think about, again, tying your methodology into data management plans and identifying the right tool to solve the problem that you're working through, it can be super advantageous in terms of the data that you're going to yield and just the productivity of your actual work. Also, enable the preservation and reuse of your data. It's great to be able to share your data. You can also get citations for that, so boosting your profile from that accord, if that's important to you. And then transparency and reproducibility. I think these two things really underpin all that is good research, but I've already sold you on that. All right, so jumping into data management plans. Now, there's nothing about your plan that is bad, and you shouldn't feel bad. We're not bringing that energy into 2024. Your plan is good, and you should feel good. Now, there's certainly ways that you can, improve things, but just in thinking about these type of things, getting it rolling, the first time you do something is always hard, right? That is always going to be the hardest one. Once you kind of get your mind around what this looks like, so it's easy, and it's just, it's about like the integrity of your research, and you know the research, and so this is just about kind of putting that data in order. So one thing that I was asked to promote, and this will be coming out in the next month or two, but there's a new DMP template coming up with the DMP assistant. DMPEG, which is the Data Management Planning Expert Group with the Alliance, is developing a new DMP template that is focused on funding applications. It's supposed to be a bit leaner, a bit more lightweight, with some more concise guidance through it. It is currently undergoing review and feedback. And I believe the final version is to be released within the DMP assistant. They said in spring, again, a couple months away. It's going to be promoted by the Alliance. There's going to be Q&A webinars and various different promotions. So if you're interested in that, keep your ear tuned, and that'll be coming soon. But when I talk about the DMP assistant and the elements of it, there are 7 basic elements. First one is data collection. Then we go into documentation and metadata, storage and backup, data preservation, data sharing and reuse, responsibilities and resources, ethics and legal compliance. So I'm going to start going through these questions and talking about what you can consider, what you can expect from these questions. And if you're a researcher, we can talk about that from your perspective. If you are those working in research support, you're interested in how this might be served, feel free, keep those questions coming. I'm feeling lonely out here. Okay, first one. What types of data will you collect, create, link to, acquire, and/or record? I think this one's pretty straightforward. We asked that question in the Padlet right away. People got it. It's worth breaking it down just in terms of, this is the type of data that I'm collecting. People talked about, brain images. Breaking that down into what those look like, what type of image files are they? Are you collecting more than one type of data associated with it? Is coding going to be part of your actual data? Maybe you're developing some sort of models for something like that. So yeah, various things that you can collect or create. Now, looking into file formats. Now, what this question is really trying to get at is that once your project is finished, are you sharing file in formats that are not married to any type of proprietary software and that are long-lasting? And so what I've put here are the best practices for the types of file formats that are not proprietary, that generally will be preservation friendly. Now, this is not to say that you can't be using proprietary formats for your research. You absolutely can. You probably should be. This is getting you to consider, once your project is done, will you be able to convert your files into one of these formats? And what will that conversion process look like? For some, it's quite easy. Like if you just work in Excel all day and then you need to convert that file to a CSV, that's a really easy process. If you're working in MATLAB and you want to convert your files, sometimes, depending on what you're doing, it can be a little bit more complicated, but there are ways to go about doing this, and it's just ensuring that you have considered this type of thing. This one, loaded question. What conventions and procedures will you use to structure, name, and version control your files to help you and others better understand how your data are organized? All right, there's a few things to pick apart here. First one, file naming. This is things you can start tomorrow, but when you're thinking of just the best practices for file naming, human and machine readable. Human readable, I think we all understand what that is. You can look at it, you can interpret it. But you also want your machine to be able to interpret it as well. And, I'll be honest, when you're thinking of or you may have seen best practices for file naming. I've linked out to resources. These are very much meant for machine readability and specifically for those working with coding languages. Special characters, coding languages do not play well with those. They don't play well with other date formats. They might play around with how they're organized. Spaces, they don't like those either. So underscores and hyphens are used to separate information chunks. If you're not using a coding language and you're tempted to step away from these best practices, I get it. I can support it to a certain extent, but like I think the biggest thing is to be consistent, right? That you don't want to have various naming conventions and just people doing different things. Maybe one day you're following something, the other day you're not. The idea is that all of your files are following a convention that you and all of your collaborators, should you have any, are following, and that things are very easy to scan and discover. Now, when you go to deposit, these file naming conventions, the best practices probably will be enforced by the people who are curating. So I do encourage you to follow these, but I know some people it just doesn't resonate with them. They don't want to, and I'm not going to force you to do anything, but I'm giving you the full realistic presentation of what this entails. Now, what this might look like for naming and versioning, because versioning was part of this, that as files grow, that you might want to build in versioning within the actual name of your file. So for something like this with a manuscript, the convention might be, you list your project, the content, and then the version of a file where the version is delineated by this VO1. So we have, the abbreviation for the project, manuscript VO1. Fairly straightforward. Potentially you want to have an idea for versioning as it goes to, editors or getting type of feedback. This can be delineated with, the editor's initials if you want to go that way on top of the versions. Now, manuscripts and feedback, they can be a bit different than data files. So down here, we see I have this interview file, and the version is actually, in this case, delineated by the date. Maybe the date that you collected it is really about the version. Now, as data grows, and this can really depend on the type of data that you're working with, but when you start manipulating data files, if that's part of your workflow, the biggest thing that I can say is save a master copy of the raw or the original data file that you get and save it as read-only so you can't edit it. That you always, that if you're playing with what your data looks like, you want to be able to go back to square one and make sure that the changes that you made, like you didn't just cause a mess that are irreversible. And that, as you're going to manipulate and play with data, having different versions where you're staging it so you can always go back can be extremely valuable. And that, you can version it with a version number, you can version it by describing the types of transformations you've made. But what I'm kind of cautioning against is making changes to your data that you can't go back from. And so you always want to be able to do things like that. In this context, I'm talking about manual versioning, right? This is built into the names. There are automated versioning systems, things like GitHub, OSF to sort of an extent, but doing things like this where you are manually building it into your name, it gives you a control over it. You're not hoping that your computer's doing something. You can see what's happening. So I would support this as a strong way to version your data as it's growing and being played with. All right. So moving on, documentation and metadata. What documentation will be needed for the data to be read and interpreted correctly in the future? Now, this question and documentation, it's not so much revealed here, but I'm going to pick this apart a bit, that a lot of what happens in the DMP assisted and data management plans are looking at data's integrity after a project's completion. They're very much aligned with sharing data after the fact, which is great. It's important. But you also want to think about the interpretability to data as it's happening, live projects, especially if you're working with collaborators, especially if you are in a lab where there's grad students coming in and out and there's new people who are interacting with the data. Big thing is README files, right? Having a file embedded right at the top level of your folders saying, this is what you can expect to find. And then, keeping that date created and updated just so people know how recent it is. things that'll have the, description of your projects, the folder contents, what people can expect to find theirs. As updates are made, detailed updates are great. Now, this is very much for the active organization, not so much for the stuff after a project's completion. But then things like file lists, folder lists, any conventions or standardized vocabularies that you're using within those, definitions of your variables. Other relevant info, I think it's always great to include things like methodologies in this, how you're coding, doing anything with the actual analysis is very important, but these are kind of the basic elements. It's what would somebody outside of your situation need to understand this data? And for those working on the projects, how would they be able to find what they're looking for in terms of files?
Nick, there was actually a question in the chat if you did want to answer that now.
Oh, I definitely want to answer it.
Yeah.
Let me take a look. To what extent can you eliminate repeated elements in a file name by instead using a defined directory structure, like that LLDR? Should it be there regardless? Does it only need to be there if the data is being deposited and may lose the folder structure? Because that does add characters to the file name that would, in theory, we want to keep short. That is a great question. So this is from my perspective, and this is really going to boil down to personal preference. If you are working on multiple projects, I always think it's great to have just a little acronym for what project it belongs to in case something, migrates to the wrong folder by accident, right? Or somebody, and it really is when you're dealing with collaborators and especially multiple collaborators, grad students incoming out, just making sure that what is being saved there is actually purposely being saved. And if you don't see that acronym at the beginning, it's more of a like, okay, what's this file doing here? Now, in terms of, eliminating that type of thing, depositing them afterwards, you can keep the folder structure for some of those. I shouldn't have said that as quickly as I did. Depending on how you're depositing the data, sometimes you can keep the folder structure. But yeah, it's worth considering these type of things. And I should have just started off by saying this. So much of this is project dependent. That, if there's an it depends aspect here, but I think the questions that you're asking are great. And if you can justify like, hey, I don't need this for this reason, you definitely don't. But it's more that you've thought about this, you have reasoning for why you didn't choose or you did choose to include it, and then you went that way. And yeah, short file names are great. The longer your file name, the harder it is to read. It becomes less human readable. We have another question. Work FAIR principles. What about how it interfaces with OCAP, PETA? Yes, so we're talking about Indigenous data and privacy and security. There's a section for that. Number 7. We're gonna back clean up with that question. So I'm gonna put a pin in that, but that's definitely something to consider. And in that resource guide, there are quite a bit of resources around sensitive data, meeting those privacy and security standards, as well as dealing with Indigenous data. Question number 2, how will you make sure that documentation is created or captured consistently throughout your project? Oh, this is a tricky one. People are wild out there. And so it's really about establishing very clear roles. And I think depending on your research environment, this is a huge, it depends. If you were the lone wolf researcher out there doing it by yourself, this is on you. It's much easier. But then when you start introducing groups, when you start introducing, again, I'm going to keep referring to that incoming, outgoing School of Graduate students. This is really where onboarding and offboarding become tremendously important. Having project managers assigning responsibilities that are clearly understood. And I think just, having a schedule and having clear expectations so everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. This can fall apart. It can fall apart. And I think, as you're establishing what those roles and responsibilities are, having those contingency plans, understanding that, if we're going to check on things every, couple weeks, every week, every month, if you can identify that things have fallen apart, what do you do to clean them up? And just, this is, again, saving you those time and headaches that if you outline this idea at the beginning, you have a plan, it will save you that effort of just having a project fall into disarray. Last minute. All right, final one for this section is documentation and metadata. If you're using metadata standards, tools to document your data, please list here. In that resource guide, I gave a list of metadata standards. These are standard vocabulary, standard ways to structure certain types of data in certain types of disciplines. this is a huge, it depends if you're using them, but feel free to check out that metadata guide if that's something that you would like to apply to your work. Within the DMP assistant, there are recommendations, advice on using these. But this is a whole can of worms in itself. So I'm probably going to put a pin in this, but if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them. All right, moving on to storage and backup. This is a fun one. What are the anticipated storage requirements for your project in terms of storage space, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, and the length of time you'll be storing it? Now, what this question is ultimately getting at is it's going to be awful if you run out of storage in the middle of your project. You want to think about this in advance. And so, file versioning and backups, you're going to be building multiple copies. Data grows over time. And the storage of data beyond the end of a project. If you are unsure about how to estimate these type of storage spaces, there's various, you can Google websites that'll help you kind of, I have this many CSV files or Excel files. It'll give you an estimate, but you can reach out to your research computing people, your RDM people, and they will help estimate this type of storage. In terms of what's available at your institutions, this is really the it depends. And this is where this next question goes. How and where will your data be stored and backed up during your research process? Yeah, there's a lot of options with this. In terms of what this question is getting at, like as you're completing a DMP, submitting for funding, they want to know that you're safeguarding your data against data loss. Should some device fail, should there be some sort of issue? And what they really push is for this 3-2-1 rule, where there are 3 different copies of your data existing on 2 different media with at least 1 copy at a different location, should there be any type of natural disaster, geographic catastrophe on that one site. Again, this is going to look different depending on what your institution is, depending on your workflows, and I think specifically depending on the sensitivity of your data. That, when I see at the bottom things aligned with funder, institutional, and other relevant regulations or policies, that, the higher risk of data you have, the more limited places that you have to store it. If you have data sharing agreements, any MOUs about who can use the data, how it can be used, these will stipulate that. But it does, the way I do things is that I have it saved on the hard drive of my computer. I back it up to my Microsoft OneDrive that I get through UBC, and then every important thing I have on an external hard drive as well. Microsoft does back it up so that is following with all of this, but I think it's important in this sense to not only have these 3 different medias, but also to consider the schedule of which you're backing things up, right? That, if you're backing things up irregularly, how far back are you willing to lose things? Like, some people have a backup schedule. I'm going to back things up every month. Well, are you willing to lose a month of work? Or is it, 2 weeks? Is it 1 week? And that, it's worth outlining that just what you are willing to deal with. It's really easy for project data and files to exist in like 3, 4, 5 different, storage locations or pieces of software or platforms. And, some people are all right with that. I find it, really difficult to navigate that, especially because everybody might have a different knowledge of what exists where and how to access it. And so, if you want everything to be as streamlined as possible, this can be part of that plan. But it's really about, building up that constellation of storage locations that you're going to be using and how you're going to be using it. And then this one, always a tricky one. How are your collaborators going to be access, modify, and contribute throughout the process? The major issues that I find when supporting researchers with storage is usually with respects to this, with some sort of sensitive data, or there's some sort of proprietary ownership over the data, and there's collaborators outside the institution, and sometimes outside of Canada. This is a huge it depends, and there are different solutions depending on what your institution has access to, what you have access to, if you have money, if you don't have money. I can't give any hard and fast rules for this, but thinking of it at the start and what this is going to look like, and making sure that you understand how these platforms are going to work, how collaboration works with these platforms, and how access works is hugely important to ensuring that nothing falls off the rails here. Plowing forward. All right, so looking at data preservation, after your project is complete, where will you deposit data for long-term preservation and access at the end of that project? Now, within that resource guide, I did give some recommendations for data repositories. A data repository is a platform specifically designed for you to put your data in after a project's completion, either to just preserve it, for people to access it, and sometimes for both, ideally for both. This note at the top, not all repositories preserve data. So you do want to make sure that if this is something you want, you are interested in preservation, that the repository you're depositing in does support this. Some options. Borealis. Many institutions have an instance of Borealis. These are servers that are located at the University of Toronto, but that institutions pay to subscribe to, and they allow you to deposit data into them. They allow you to set up collections. You can set up wider collections for research clusters or your own groups. That way you can have some folder hierarchies that allow you to kind of separate individual projects, get a little bit more granularity in that sense. Borealis does allow you to kind of set up some access restrictions. So if you want to deposit data in that, but maybe not release it for a year due to some funder embargoes, you can absolutely do that. There are file size restrictions for depositing in Borealis. I believe it's 50 gigs. Could be wrong about that number. So if you do have huge files or large amounts of files, that's something worth considering. You probably won't be able to deposit it in Borealis. But that brings up FRDR. FRDR, that is also in the resource guide, stands for the Federated Research Data Repository, and Canada can be in there. This is an alliance product, almost lost my language there. And what this is really meant to fill the gap is kind of two things. If your institution does not pay for a Borealis subscription, FRDR is open to all researchers across Canada. It works much like the Alliance compute systems, where you do need to be a faculty researcher to apply for an allocation, but then you can grant grad students from any type of lab managers to your allocation. By default, FRDR provides a terabyte of of space to deposit your data in, and it works with Globus file transfer. So if you are working with large data, or you're working with data on the compute clusters with the Alliance, you can transfer the data directly from those clusters to FRDR using Globus. That's, high-speed transfer for large data. If you need more than a terabyte, they tend to be very receptive to having those conversations, and you have to justify it. We'll talk about just kind of what data you need to share afterwards, I think in a slide or two. But they are eager to have those conversations, have people deposit their data. And finally, I put this link in the resources, the Registry of Research Data Repositories. Some people, it's mainly discipline specific, but they want their research data to exist where the people in their discipline are putting it. And so the Registry of Research Data Repositories is a way that you can search up disciplinary repositories across the globe that would suit the type of data that you're trying to deposit. One thing I should have mentioned, missed this, but for both Borealis and FRDR, they do not support the deposit of sensitive data. That is something that is being worked on right now, but there are different privacy legislations across Canada. It can be very difficult to figure out just how to do that, what that looks like. People are earnestly trying to solve this solution, but as of right now, you can't deposit sensitive data. In terms of de-identified data, certain instances of Borealis use it, depending what type of level of curation is there. That institutions, when you go to deposit it, someone can curate the data to make sure that it's met certain standards. Not all of them will allow that, but some will. And then indicate how you ensure your data is preservation friendly. And so this is basically everything that I've been talking about up until this point. So your file formats, the integrity, chances are that, you'd want to make sure that what is in those files is actually in those files, that something hasn't happened over your research process. Any de-identification that you need to do, and those supporting documents. And so you can see how that most of the work that's going into a data management plan is thinking about what this is going to look like on the back end so you can deposit data. Are there any questions about preservation? Anything at all?
Nick?
Yes. Who is
Sorry,
that? Hey,
it's
Joyce.
Joyce Thompson. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question about preservation and images. And
Yes.
I keep thinking about, okay, I've got multiple backups. Of course, I save my original. I have my original, but if you want to back it up, then that makes a copy of it. And, you start to get away from the original. And I'm just wondering how much people need to worry about that, or what do we need to know about it, or where do we go to find it?
Yeah, and so are you talking about backing up of like data that or images you're planning to preserve, or more active?
Yeah, well, yeah, data that it's image data that is being used for research purposes, and it would need to be deposited, and preserved.
Yeah, and so it's always great, like I said, that 3-2-1 rule, like when you're looking at what the tri-agencies would be looking for if they're actually adjudicating a DMP, hitting those things, like that really is the buzz phrase. So you have 3 different copies existing of 2 mediums, and they're in different locations. Like that is I think the gold standard for something like this. Obviously, like when I think your question, you were talking about maybe compressing images and losing what
Yes.
the original image is. Yeah, that's certainly a consideration. And so it's estimating the amount of storage that you would need for something like that. And if you're dealing with really big images, I don't know if you're dealing with MRI images or just really high quality like pictures of other things. It really is about just ensuring that at the beginning of the process, you know how many pictures you're going to be taking and you're timesing it by 3. That
Right.
if the quality of the picture is really important to the research,
Yep.
that should be maintained. If it's, less important, you can compress. But yeah, that's a trick that
So
you need to think about.
so I get it. The thing is to plan ahead, to understand how much space the high quality pictures are going to need. Okay, I get that.
Yeah, and then if they're sensitive, then obviously the options to store them are more limited than if they're not sensitive.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Super.
yeah.
That heads me in the right direction in my mind.
Okay, cool.
Thank you.
And then
Yep.
for something like that, Furter would be a good place to deposit them just because it does allow for large data, and using Globus, you could transfer them quite quickly if they're large files. That can be a real pain if
Yeah.
you're not using the high transfer
Yeah.
process.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No worries. How's everybody else doing? The best practices for managing the multiple copies and backups. It's really about having a schedule that, like some software, like something like Microsoft OneDrive, it automates backup. So like you can count on it for things like that. If you are dealing with software or platforms that aren't automatically backing up your research data, it's having a schedule. And I think I had spoken to this, but just to reiterate it if I had forgotten, it's what you're willing to lose. So if you're willing to put in a week of work, and then you have that copy, and that every week you back up everything, then that seems like something very reasonable. But if you are getting a lot of work done in that week, you want it to be every couple days, maybe at the end of every day, that's what you should do. And so it's really about having that schedule, but also communicating that with any of your collaborators so everybody is on the same page. And then for doing those backups, just ensuring that your versions are all kept up to date, right? If you just keep backing things up, but you're not updating the versions or indicating what type of changes, what's being backed up, you can run into to some disarray, and you can be using storage unnecessarily. Yeah, and so did that answer your question, Luna? Because I saw that you qualified that with how about in the context of having to restore data from a certain point in time? Yeah, and so that idea of staging and checkpointing things is super important. And I think I mentioned this in the context of versioning, that as you're manipulating or playing with data, that once you make a significant change, that saving and staging that copy so you can return to it is super important. It'll be very specific to the type of work that you're doing and your workflows, but always, I think that idea of, yes, staging, saving, versioning copies of the progression of your data and its manipulations are very important to be able to return to what you've done. Testing the process of restoring a backup is also a good idea. Yeah, absolutely. Plowing forward, sharing and reuse. So I think I hinted at this earlier, but sorry, that's my dog yawning. Hello. What data will you be sharing, and in what forms? Raw, process, analyze, final. So I had mentioned at the beginning that this term raw data might it was challenged by people working in the humanities. And so I'm putting the quote unquote raw. This is a term that is used in the DMP assistant, but I think a better term is the original data, the data that you received right at the beginning. And this is the original state of your data. Process data is manipulated in some ways. As I mentioned, this can continuously be manipulated in a number of different ways. The analyzed data, this is the data that you're getting your results, that this is potentially data that you're using to visualize, data that you're using to just derive the results that you're going to be writing about in whatever publication. Then your final data, process data in a preservation-friendly format. The big question here is, what data do you need to share? You don't need to share all of it, right? And so this is really a project-specific question, that what is important for you to share that would allow your process to be reproducible and transparent, right? And just maybe, I think sharing the original data is always vitally important, but sometimes there can be sensitivities or reasons that can't be shared. And then, as you get into potentially sharing process data, what is important about that data that you feel that you need to share? And that, if you're processing it, sharing the information of those manipulations, whether you're coding it, whether you're manually playing with it, giving people the directions and the recipe to follow along, that is about that transparency and reproducibility. And so, whatever it is that you decide to share, this is the point of this question is to be purposeful. What could people use for this to be transparent and reproducible? And if people were going to build on this process, if people were going to use your data as part of a bigger analysis, what would they need? And again, very project specific. Happy to answer any questions people might have. In addition to this, end user licenses to include with your data. In that resource guide, I've given a link to the Creative Commons licenses. These are the most common types of licenses that go on these type of assets. Sometimes your funders will require certain types of licenses. If you are dealing with collaborators, you'll want to talk to them. If you have any data sharing agreements, MOUs, those can all stipulate the types of end user license to include with your data. So it's just worth considering what you are allowed to share, how you are allowed to share it. Examples of this, like the CC BY is that people are allowed to use your data, but they have to give you attribution. They have to say, I found it from this source. You can, set that up a notch, where people are allowed to use your data, but they can't use it for commercial purposes, and they need to give you attribution. And so there's various different granularities with the type of licenses. Familiarize yourself, pick the one that lends itself best to your research. And this one, what steps will be taken to help the research community know that your data exists? There's various ways you can go about doing this. This is very discipline specific, but I think this question is making sure that, that there's people know that it's out there, that you can attach it to your paper. I think that's one of the most important ways to do this, that when you're publishing a paper and you have deposited your data, the data deposits will mint what's called a DOI. It's a digital object identifier, and it's a persistent link. So you can put it anywhere, people can click on it, link back to your data. It's creating that little constellation that's all of your research. So, there's various ways that can be doing that, but I think embedding the DOI in your paper is one of the most important, with a data availability statement too. So that can talk about what the license looks like and things along those lines. Getting to the end, responsibilities and resources. Oh, this is always the fun one. Who's responsible for managing the project's data after the project? And the major data management tasks for which they will be responsible. And I'm going to link this with the second one, is if people leave, what happens? What is the contingency plans, especially if there's a change in principal investigator? They leave the institution, they move away from the process. These are where major disruptions come in. And it's always really important to set this type of thing up in advance. It's hard for me to speak to this in details because this looks so different depending on the context and what the overturning looks like. But again, so much of what's in a data management plan is just thinking about this stuff at the beginning, and just, assigning tasks, being very clear that when tasks are assigned, you're not just telling one person what they're doing. Everybody understands what that one person is doing. Their responsibilities are very clearly communicated, and that, if people are leaving, like, what happens? Like, sometimes data can get orphaned, projects can get really halted up. So having some plans for that type of thing is super important. And then this one is a really interesting one because, you know, doing this stuff, everything that I've been talking about, it's more work, right? It is more work. And so if this is, you know, additional hours for a lab manager, for grad students that you want to encourage this, like, from my perspective, if the tri-agencies are saying that you have to do this type of thing, it's very fair for you to build that into your budget with your grants. And that, you know, I think I've heard various numbers, you know, 10, 15% extra to ask for, you know, graduate student work to help ensure that data is managed consistently throughout this. I think that this, because it is such a new thing, that there's a bit of uncertainty about what this looks like. But again, like this is something that is being imposed through a policy. It is more work. And so I think it's only fair to, you know, not only estimate these overall costs for it, but build it into your funding requests. Well, powering forward. And so someone was asking about sensitive data. We have arrived here. If your research project includes sensitive data, how will you ensure that it's securely managed only to approved members of the project? Access controls are hugely important. And so, you know, I think that this is applying not only to the storage platforms that you use, but in going back, we talked about folder structures. Folder structures can be a really good way not only to organize a project, but to organize the way in which access is granted to various points of a project. That not everybody needs to access everything in a project, right? And maybe it's important that certain people see that folders or certain files exist, but they can't open them. Maybe they can only read them, they can't manipulate them. And so outlining who is part of your process and how they are going to access this is really important. And again, ensuring that the storage platform that you're using is meeting any type of regulations that you would use, right? Are the servers in Canada? That's always a big one. If you're dealing with collaborators in the States, you know, that or even globally, things can get a little tricky here. And so, you know, at the bottom, this idea of consent form language and talking to your ethics office, that this is a huge one, right? That, you know, if for whatever reason the data that you're dealing with, you know, you have collaborators, it can't all exist in Canada. How do you ensure that this can happen in a safe and secure way via data transfer and in informing all of your participants that this is what is happening with your data and making sure that you know that this is absolutely necessary, but they're absolutely informed about what's happening. And then, you know, secondary uses of sensitive data. Again, this is your consent form. This is your ethics office saying, you know, that there are ways that this can go about doing this, but you need to be very precise in your language that the ethics office, they are looking to protect participants more than they're looking to enable your research. And you know, I'm saying that aloud just because that's the angle that they're coming from, that institutions are protecting themselves from liabilities through ethics office. And that I'm not in any way trying to villainize them. That's a very, very important role to play. But ethics offices are also becoming more ingrained in the RDM process and understanding that secondary uses of data is very important, that allowing data to move around to enable research is becoming more important. In that resource guide towards the bottom, there are a number of different resources and some about sensitive data. And I think one of which is talking about some potential consent form language that you can use. Some of the talking ethics language that you can use. It was created by the RDM team, it was Portage at that time. It's now the Alliance, but it was giving you ideas. But again, this is talking to your ethics office, making sure they're all right with this. Ethics offices are busy. This can add some time to your project. So, you know, if this is something that you are interested in doing, reaching out to them early is always an important thing to do. And, you know, I think that that's so much about what I'm saying, but it can be a tricky world. I know that there was someone who had questions about this, and I'm speaking about this quite broadly, but if you want to get into the specifics of, you know, if you have a project in mind or generalities of what this looks like, I'd be happy to answer it. I think there's one more question. Legal, ethical, and intellectual property issues. So the past was talking very much about ethics in terms of the sensitivity of dealing with probably human data. But ownership of data is hugely important, that if you're dealing with any type of commercial partners, talking about the legalities of who owns that data. There's questions about indigenous data, and I saw that the person had mentioned OCAP. That's so project specific. And I think one of the biggest things that with respects to following OCAP principles, but also following things like the CARE principles that I put in the resource guide as well at the bottom, is spending time to build relationships. That's in order to have respectful relationships with the indigenous communities that you might be working for, you need to drastically slow down the rate at which research is conducted. And it can be tricky because generally institutions don't prioritize slowing things down. It's all about fast, 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 more, more, more. And I think that this is changing, but that's really what those principles are about. It's about respectful, mutually beneficial relationships, and just ensuring that everybody is getting something out of it and is well understood. Are there any final questions that people want to tag in about, or have things that they want clarification about, or yeah, really anything? I'm hanging out. We have 25 minutes.